Hey everybody, how's it going? How's it doing? This is your boy, your man's homeless failed American artist. Eglin's best. A little bit less Eglin's best nowadays because I gotta let this go for too long, and now I'm just gonna have to figure something out with that to keep it shaved and whatever. Um, I had already recorded a response video to my last post, which has taken off significantly for whatever reason. I think it's because of far right wingers and militant right wingers got a hold of it and started sharing it across social media and was like, oh, look at this fucking liberal homeless guy and this crackhead and blah, 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 blah. Because most of the comments I got on that, or I had a fair amount of comments where it was like, get sober, man, get sober. And I hate to tell everyone, I'm not on drugs. I'm not even on alcohol. I'm not on anything. Not even a little bit of tweeds or weed every once in a while. I don't do any of that. Which feeds into the overall stigma against it and the idiocy that is applied to homelessness. Um, and just the general misunderstanding of it. And at one point in time, sure, there may have been, arguments for that being the primary, group of people. But even at that, it's always been a prevalent thing that a large part of the homeless portion or population, or there's a fair amount of people who are veterans, for example, veterans on the streets dying. Um, who aren't necessarily on drugs and stuff like that, who aren't necessarily, alcoholics, whatever. I mean, a lot of them have had some issues with substances, but that's because of their trauma that was never dealt with, or their psychosis, or the things that we've, allowed them to go out there and accumulate, that we've abandoned them as soldiers of this nation and stuff like that. Um, and it's a whole dichotomy of homelessness that usually isn't talked about, because then and I noticed that dialogue amongst homeless rhetoric or whatever is really not something that's put forward, especially when it comes to mentions of, for example, the elderly who've been thrown out on the streets from rest homes and stuff like that, um, and the mentally disabled. And mental disability can take many forms, and I consider schizophrenia and mental illnesses as a mental disability because, for example, schizophrenia, I mean, if you're seeing hallucinations or you're seeing things that aren't there, or talking to people who aren't there, um, you're not able to function, without some serious treatments, medicines, potentially stuff like that. But we don't put that forward when we discuss, of course, the homeless population. We put forward, oh, these are a bunch of crackheads and alcoholics and ne'er-do-wells and degenerates, and that's all they are. Um, and especially over the last couple of years with fentanyl becoming a huge thing that's been flooded into America, of course, FDA approved, just like OxyContin, thrown out there in the streets and allowed to consume America. Um, I mean, with fentanyl and meth and stuff like this hitting the market and hitting the streets, and fentanyl especially, it causes a lot of psychosis and issues that are, I've seen it over and over and over again, and it's just madness that it causes. And once a person gets on that and gets in that world and degrades, and bearing in mind that fentanyl is one of those things that you're almost guaranteed. It's the first drug I've ever seen where you're pretty much guaranteed with low dosage to get an overdose. And there's a lot of people out there who have OD'd multiple times and have been brought back. And you can't be brought back that many times, man, without it doing some seriously bad damage to your brain. And how it hasn't consumed America completely up to this point, I don't know. I think it has consumed a vast majority of America and has been a lot bigger of a problem than people are willing to admit or acknowledge. But of course, that's the American way, right? That's the American pseudo philanthropy way. Um, Interesting thing about, for example, Luigi Mangione, and I was watching programs on things like Luigi Mangione lately, and he's been brought up. And a lot of, some people commented, and this goes into pseudo philanthropy, I promise, but some people commented is like, I hope that he survives basically the fallout after all this general interest and this trending interest happens across social media, and then people basically forget about him 4 months later and forget the lesson learned and forget everything, which is just how our society is engineered nowadays. And a lot of that is instant consumption, instant forgetting, and stuff like that. And I mean, who's to blame? Some people in some regards, man, because Dave Chappelle said it best in his special, I think his first Netflix special back, but he was talking about, the age of spin, where he was talking about, you guys, back in his day, and, he's relatively the same age as me, but back in our day, we had like disasters, but it was spread out, like we'd have the, for example, the Challenger disaster and stuff like that. And then, it would be a while before we had something else, but starting since 9/11, I'd say, um, it's been like, just increasingly worse and worse every year, to where, you have a spaceship exploding every day. And that's true. And it's like, you can only handle so much, especially with mass shootings. Mass shootings became like just a plague at some point. It was just like, God almighty, man. Like, and yet still, the body count raises and raises and raises in that regard. And once again, the government does nothing about it, because they're owned by gun lobbyists. They're owned by lobbyists. They're owned by lobbyists of all these, corporations and stuff like that. Big oil, big pharmaceutical, big everything owns the government right now. Um, our mandates, our governing institutions are not dictated by what the people need, but what the lobbyists and the rich need. And I said it in the other video, and I'll say it again. They go to the golf course, they go to the country clubs, they go to the gated communities, and that's where they carve up the world. And that's where they make the decisions. And that goes to, goes into, the point of Raleigh here. Raleigh has a huge protest, thing. And I've always, while I admire protest and I respect protest, and I see it as, now in this day and age, just a useless thing. Um, it really, because if the ears upstairs aren't listening, then what's the point of sitting out on a street corner and fucking screaming at them? If they're deaf and blind to the plight of Americans, which I don't know how they are, I mean, and there's really no excuse for it, because this ain't something that just happened overnight. For example, the wage gap, the oligarchy that has formed around us and has seized control of the government now. And I'm not just talking about Trump's administration. I'm talking about the Democrats too, because they're blind to the working man's plight. And you've seen that through, if you watch footage of voters and echo through voters and stuff like that. A lot of them weren't, especially in rural working communities, a lot of them weren't exactly, pro-Trump like you would think. They were just trying to basically, they were bought into the fact of, the lies of, I'm going to get people to work and I'm going to create jobs and stuff like that. Even though he lied about that during his first run up, where he said, they went to some mining towns and stuff like this, where he said he was going to bring all these jobs, and it never manifested. But basically, some voters were just like, I don't care who's in office as long as they fucking address the issues that are. And a lot of people were echoing that. I don't care if it's Democrat or Republican, as long as they're addressing the issues of the working class person. If and they're not. That's because they're, like I said, jaded. They're money before anything else, money over mankind. There's a saying that I created over time called, that basically said, what happened to we the people, instead of me the greedy? What the fuck happened to that? We the people. And now it's me the greedy. And you see it every day, and you see it in every way. The sickness of capitalism, or at least the capitalism run awry that we've allowed to happen here in America, is basically, keeping up appearances. For example, Tesla was able to seize a lot of power and stuff like that in this country because Tesla, the electric capabilities and the AI capabilities of the self-driving car and shit, I don't even think it mattered at some point. What mattered was you were driving a car that nobody else could afford, and that made you feel better than your fellow Americans. So therefore, you had to get it, you had to buy it, and it was a prestige symbol rather than anything else. And meanwhile, there's other cars that have innovated in that respect. And one of them, once again, I still have yet to look up and research this company, but Rivian is one of those companies that's a competitor to Tesla in the electric market. And as far as I know, I think I did look up a little bit, but Rivian was founded by one of the founders of Tesla who left the company and said, okay, fuck this, I'm getting out of here. And they wanted to go do it right in their way. And with the oligarchy and the things that are happening now here in America too, there's a lot of subversion and suppression of opinion and stuff like that. Like, for example, Rivian, I had never even heard of the company or seen the company, and you had to really dig to find information about this company. And I'm sure that's way intentional because Tesla had bought and controlled a lot of the media influence and stuff like that, I'm sure. And for the longest time, and I've spoken enough about this, but I'm going to say it again. For the longest time, and I'm not going to lie to you, back in the day, I was a I was an Elon Musk supporter because, for all intents and purposes, all the media coverage and everything I ever seen of the man, up until recently, he was a philanthropist. He was a person who was trying to make legitimate change in the world and stuff like that. Now, to be fair, from what I've seen and seen from other people, was basically he wants to make the change only if he's the one making the change, and he wants to foster those ideas only if he's the one who basically gets the credit, and that's just not, of course, what we need. And recently too, it was a very big thing that Trump allowed immigrants into America and basically gave them a first class passage to America, and they were South Africans. And I coincidentally wonder if that was part of Elon. It's no question that it was part of Elon's doing, that he's funneled these South Africans who were, I don't know if they're confirmed racist or what, from South Africa, but South Africa is very prevalent with racism. And just brought them here to America. Meanwhile, he's deporting people of different colors and stuff like that out of the country, mainly Latin peoples, targeting them. But yet he brought in these immigrants who were all white, gave them a first class ride to America, and saved them from South African tyranny or whatever, which is basically, I guess, and I really haven't looked into it, but I assume that is retribution against apartheid and what the whites have done there. Which, if you ever look it up, is very fucked up and racist and horrible, what they've done in South Africa. But I digress. So getting back to the previous video, homelessness, the capitalist prison without bars, it has generated a very big response. The response that I've gotten has showed me and verified that it's something that I'm going to have to tackle, and I'm going to have to lay down in writing and do a very deep dive series on it and put together my thoughts and organize my thoughts into, basically a big synopsis and an observation of it. One thing that I can offer the world, I feel, is a perspective from somebody who has gone through homelessness off and on over these, since the beginning of the pandemic, and basically kept his sanity, and sobriety, and seeing the horrors of this, world, the world of homelessness and what's going on, and specifically in a place where, I feel Gastonia is a very unique bubble and special place in regards to this, because once again, 700 churches, no homeless shelters. And I don't care what anybody says, the proof is in the pudding, man. If you have 700 churches in an area and no homeless shelters, something has gone very wrong. And I'm not even saying like the homeless shelter bit is, and from what I understand, once again, if I'm wrong about this, correct me, but Gastonia had basically a law that said that they could only have one homeless shelter in operation at one given point in time. And that was, I don't know what had happened with that. Somebody has to do an investigation on that and really deep dive into where that law became mandated and who influenced that law. And I wouldn't be a damn bit surprised if the Salvation Army in that time paid the local government of Gaston County to make that a law and make that a mandate, because then the Salvation Army would basically have complete control of the town. But anyways, and that may be an investigation I conduct in the future. Now, bearing in mind, once I get past this homeless period, this right here, which I've already stated in the other video, will pretty much not be a reality. I've gotten so used and so many tricks and so many things of the trade of surviving homelessness, to where if I can help it, I'm never going back. And until things change with rental properties in this country, I'm never going back to a rental property or anything like that if I can ever help it again. Point blank, period. Until shit starts changing with the rental rates and housing costs and stuff like this, I mean, and you know, I could bank that money and put that money toward other things like my artwork and my video production and doing other projects and stuff like that. I mean, you know, but going back to Gaston County, the 700 churches bit, the reason why I'm so militant or radicalized against Gaston County and stuff like that and their bullshit is because, you know, I stood outside of those churches during the winter freezing to death, man, before, and only this past winter have they opened up churches to provide overnight shelters in the town. But, you know, before then, they were placing all that responsibility on Salvation Army, stuff like that. And they only would allow people to go into the kitchen. And it was like, you know, the kitchen can only house so many people, and the kitchen wasn't that big. And basically, you slept on cots, stacked like fish, crammed in together, you know, because it was trying to house 60 people in a space that was meant for 20 tops, you know, and then there'd be families show up in the middle of the night and crazy shit. And, you know, there'd be noise, and I mean, it's just not viable. But regardless, there should have been churches that opened up and helped funnel the burden to that. And really, you know, and some of the shit I've seen in homelessness and stuff like that, the hypocrisy and stuff. For example, one of the places that opened up last winter, before I left Gaston County, you know, it gets dark around 5 o'clock during the winter time here in North Carolina, 5:30. It was a freezing night, and they had one of the shelters, and they were going to open up. And they didn't have cots. You slept on concrete floors because they said that the cots were in violation of a fire thing. But yet, in the same turn, the fire department was the ones who were supposed to bring the cots. But then all of a sudden they changed their mind, so everybody ended up sleeping on the concrete floor. Well, that wasn't the problem. The problem was that a police officer who was stationed exclusively at this shelter showed up like an hour, 10 minutes later, however long it was. Now, bearing in mind, he knew where to be, when to be, and how to get there. And that was, as far as I'm concerned, should have been his only duty for the night, was to go to this place. But yet, and it wasn't a security guard, it was a police officer. It was a Gaston County police officer who was stationed there. And he didn't show up for like an hour and a half, so everybody stood outside cold. Now, the people who were running the shelter would not allow anybody in. So they made everybody sit outside for an hour in the freezing temperatures. And they didn't even bring out food or hot liquids or anything like that. They just, and you know, the woman who was there doing whatever kept running outside and be like, "Are you okay? Are you okay? Are you okay?" And it's like, at some point, it's almost like if you say, "No, I'm not fucking okay. I'm freezing to death. When the fuck can we come inside?" Like they would have banned you from the property. And that's kind of how it goes with a lot of, you know, shelter programs, is they'll push you and they'll say shit to you, but you can't speak back. You can't, you know, and that's, you know, goes even further into the prison aspect of it, is, you know, you're more or less an inmate. You know, you're more or less treated as that. And for a lot of the philanthropic organizations, I hate to say it, but that's just in my experience, I've seen them put the foot forward of, you are a prison. You know, you are a prisoner, you are an inmate. You know, they have an inmate mentality. Now, bearing in mind, I understand that there's been incidences in the past, probably, and some bad things happening. But to be fair, you're really not even understanding the community you're trying to serve. And I mentioned this before, Danielle Webb from Displaced Roses, a community or organization in Gaston County that's done most of the most viable work I've ever seen through the homeless community, and really substantial results, is because she understands the community. And not only, and whatever she started out, whenever she started her mission and her journey years ago, whatever she didn't understand about homelessness, she asked. Whatever she didn't understand about the community or what was going on, she learned over time. That's because she opened her eyes and opened her heart and fucking listened and actually broke down methods and tactics of helping people and really understanding the issues. And that was the point, and that was the thing that blew me away with her. One woman by herself was able to do more than 700 churches, a city council, and a Rotary Club in Gaston County, and really impact the community. And it's awful funny that Danielle was outside of the system of traditional whatever. She was an independent. She wasn't coming in through the traditional means. They couldn't control her. They couldn't regulate her. They couldn't put her under pressure. And she was getting things done. And that's awful funny to me. And that whole experience, that whole world, that whole seeing and hearing her story and just hearing the ridiculous stuff that she's even had to face in her current church. Just shows me, just, it's all the proof I ever need. And trust me, everything I ever do about homelessness, everything I ever put out there about homelessness and my opinions and stuff like that has not been formed overnight. This has been over years of consistently seeing, and not just me, other people spin out in the system, get held down, get bullshitted out of the system. I could provide you with citations and references to people that if they ever wanted to speak, they could tell you their story. And I don't think he'd mind me mentioning his name, but my friend Jarrell. Once again, I've told this story before, but I'm going to go back over it with you real quick. Jarrell was from New York. He was a very successful person. He survived in a city like New York for years, and then he moved to Belmont, North Carolina, and everything went to shit in his life. Everything went horribly wrong in Belmont because of a corrupted, company he was working for. And they basically put him out on the street and basically, or put him out of the job. And then when he went to go look at some things and was counting on some things being solid, he didn't realize that a family member had screwed up some things for him. And then all of a sudden he was in a situation. He came to Gastonia to go to this homeless shelter there, Salvation Army, once again, which is where most of the Tri-County area starts to bring their people, either between Charlotte and Gastonia. And because that was the only place, those two were the only places serving in at least 5-6 counties around the area. So they were getting all this shit from all these other places thrown into their counties, and they were still not doing anything about it. I mean, Charlotte has responded, but in the same turn, Charlotte is still having a lot of hang-ups and issues because, especially after Gastonia closed, I think a lot of people flooded Charlotte. And last winter, from my understanding, all of their shelters were completely at capacity. There was no, room in the shelters and stuff like that, and it was a crisis. And once again, this is something that should be anticipated when working in these communities. You would think it's like, okay, well, one day, what if? And I just don't see where the foresight doesn't come in, but they did, and they mobilized. And Charlotte has a lot more philanthropic organizations from different communities coming in, but Gastonia is one of the outliers, which funneled just as much problems with, just as much homeless issues as Charlotte, because once again, they were serving so many communities and areas around them. And it would even get to the point, and this is a real thing, and I'm sure it happens in other places too, where, like for example, Belmont is between Gastonia and Charlotte. So if I and my friend Jarrell ended up homeless in Belmont, and basically how he ended up in Gastonia was a cop picked him up and was like, "Hey man, we don't, basically roundabout way, we don't allow homeless here in fucking Belmont." So what they did was they picked him up and just took him out to Gastonia and dropped him off. And it was like, okay, here you go. And that's how basically it works for a lot of counties. And I've seen it, like you go to the bus station, you'd see guys getting out of jail from another county, and it's like they're homeless, and they just show up at the bus station in Gaston County, throw them out of the van. Not throw them out of the van, but be like, oh, well, here you go, buddy. And then just leave them in Gaston County. And that was their solution. And that's a solution that's been around a lot of areas of the nation, I would assume. And some of these areas, like you get out here in some of the Midwest and all these other areas, and you start looking into it, and there is like literally nowhere for homeless people to go. And it's like, if you become homeless in those areas, man, you're screwed. I mean, you're literally homeless on an island that, in the middle of nowhere. For example, like the cornfields in Nebraska and places like that, it's like, God forbid if you become homeless there. And it's like, where the hell do you go? Where, like, you're 20, 15, 20 miles away from any kind of like aid or organization. And I mean, I'm sure out there, people will just shoot you and put you in the cornfields if they don't like you walking down their road or something, like, but, it's something I'm going to work on more and develop further and get to wherever. But Jarrell is one of my prime examples of, just how easy you could become homeless, just how quickly you could become homeless. And side note with that, because of his interactions with the Salvation Army when he was kicked out over, something that didn't exist and something he didn't do, and he just ended up being kicked out because the worker didn't like him. That's just how it goes. And I mean, is strong, and he's a very strong person. He's a very intelligent person. He's a very, he's a fighter. He's a survivor. He grew up in New York City. I mean, come on, he has that hustle mentality. He just started because of the actions of Gaston County, he started to degrade. He started to fall to pieces in Gaston County. And he had to basically escape, and he just escaped and climbed tooth and nail to somewhere else. And that's essentially my story. Like, that there's something seriously horribly wrong in Gaston County, and it goes beyond just the system failures. It goes to a point of there's some kind of just bad aura or juju or something over it, and I can't explain it, but it's just like. So anyways, that's the video. Thanks for watching the other video. Please check out the other video. I'll link it in the description. Leave your comments, negative or positive. It really doesn't make any regard to me. Positive comments are appreciated. And I suggest you check out the comments on there, because there's some people on there with some stories of their own homeless struggle and what they're going through. Some people talking about they got families and they're living paycheck to paycheck, and basically they're about to go out on the streets with their family because nobody can afford these damn rental rates and stuff like that, which is millions of Americans right now are, living on that razor's edge. And over the next 2 years, we'll see a lot more people get on these streets, a lot more families, a lot more, working class, hard working people, because, it's just, they can't come up with the thousands and thousands of dollars a month for, a horrible rental property. So anyways, and look at the comments on that video too, because that's going to show you the stigma, the misunderstanding, and the idiocy generally applied to homelessness. Because once again, several commenters were like, get sober, man, get sober, get sober. And I dare anyone to go on there and to find any instance through my entire catalog of videos where I was on dope, where I was on drugs, where I seemed drunk, where I seemed out of it, where I seemed just. And that's awful funny. I mean, and if you ever want to check I could provide my own criminal background check. If you'd like to check and see how many drug charges and everything else I have on my record, there's nothing there. So anyways, I'll talk to you guys later. Thanks for watching. I just wanted to kind of give this little follow-up to that, and there'll be more to come. And please like, comment, and subscribe.